Oh, he was on. Oh,
Good afternoon. Let's get started. Our speaker next week will be Nicholas Miller, who is an associate professor of environmental economics at Middlebury College. Nick will talk to us on the social costs of energy production and use in the United States, consequences for measures of output and growth. Please join us for that talk next week. It's a great pleasure to introduce to you our speaker today, Dr. Francis O'Sullivan, who is the Director of Research and Analysis at the MIT Energy Initiative. He is also a senior lecturer at the MIT Sloan School of Management. His research focuses on a range of topics in energy markets, in finance, technology, regulation, and policy, across a range of different energy technologies, including unconventional oil and gas, solar, which you'll hear about today, storage, and LNG markets, and so on. Frank has been involved in many very important studies that have had and continue to have broad impact, including being a lead author on both the 2011 MIT Future of Natural Gas study and more recently this year, the MIT Future of Solar Energy study. Frank holds a PhD and a master's degree in electrical engineering from MIT and a bachelor's degree from the National University of Ireland. He has obviously published widely, is being a sought-after speaker, but then he has also been an advisor on very many important panels and committees, including to the Secretary of Energy, Secretary of Leasing. Frank.
Thanks, Varun. You should hold the applause until afterwards. Then you can decide. Well, listen, it's an absolute pleasure to be in Texas, of course, and Austin. It's my first time in Austin, actually, and it's been great so far. So, Varun, thank you so very much for the kind invitation down and for the opportunity to make some remarks to this class. I like the class. Varun described what this class is all about, and I was like, that's the kind of class I'd like to be taking. So, kudos to you all. The topic that I'm going to speak on today, solar energy in the States, here in the United States, and its growth and its challenges, is really something that's become increasingly fascinating for me and for many of my colleagues at MIT in the past couple of years. It's really because, unlike a lot of the other topics that we study, say the oil and gas sector, which are already massive, incumbent, solar energy is much, much more nascent. There's a tremendous amount of uncertainty. There's a tremendous amount of dynamic with respect to the technology, with respect to its impact on markets, potentially, with respect to the regulatory frameworks that determine, that have an impact upon it. And so what I'm going to do is walk you through our reflections on where we are today with respect to solar globally and specifically here in the States, as I said, and how that might evolve going forward, some of the challenges that the sector will certainly face, and not just the sector, the broader power system will face in embracing solar if we choose to do so. And really all of this is going to be framed in the context of solar playing a role in a future where carbon is going to be constrained. So our future of studies, including the future of solar energy, are framed with respect to the role that individual energy pathways could play in a future where carbon emissions are going to have to be constrained. And solar energy is particularly important in that context because of the scale of the resource, its distribution, and the potential ramp up that we can have in solar in meeting demand in emerging markets in particular. So right now, globally, if we look at where a lot of the rubber is going to meet the road with respect to CO2 emissions, We can certainly, and we need to focus on ourselves in Europe and so on, but these are markets that are mature. These are markets actually where emissions are actually falling in some instances. But globally, in places like India, there's going to be real demand growth for electricity, and they're going to be faced with a choice in the very near term as to how they're going to meet that demand. And if they choose carbon-intensive technologies, coal, for example, there's going to be a lock-in effect for 20, 30, 40 years. Solar offers an alternative, potentially, to that lock-in, but they have to embrace it in the nearer term. So it's really important to kind of understand these dynamics today. So just a little bit more about the solar resource itself and why it is important. So here's just a map of global irradiance levels, average irradiance levels. And the only point really that we want to emphasize here is that the solar resource happens to be broadly distributed, right? The sun shines everywhere, every day, except in Ireland, where I come from. Ironically enough, if we look at the map, right, the region of the world today, not going to be for long, but today where we have the largest installed capacity of solar PV in particular, is Northern Europe, which happens to have a very poor solar resource. But they have a very interesting attitude, the Germans at least, and that's why they have it. But more broadly, if we look at tomorrow's demand centers, so as I said, India, China, of course, and certainly Africa in the longer term, these are parts of the world where they actually have an excellent solar resource, and so that helps. Doesn't make it a shoe-in, but it certainly helps solar's cause in terms of competitiveness and so on. And even here in the States, we actually happen to have a tremendously excellent solar resource. Here in Texas, it's very, very good, and of course in California and other parts of the Southwest. And so this is really an option that we need to be looking at, particularly now as the economics have been improving. And I'm going to speak about that in detail this afternoon. Now, some very basic stuff for those of you who perhaps are not all that familiar with solar. There are many ways for us to actually utilize solar energy. In fact, ultimately our fossil resources are solar resources if we go all the way back. But practically speaking today, to generate electricity, we have two options. We have photovoltaics, which are the ubiquitous panel, and we have concentrated solar power, CSP. And these two technologies have some advantages and some disadvantages, relatively speaking. PV, as I said, it's the one that we all kind of immediately think of. It's by far the most mature option, pathway. 97% of global installed capacity is PV. As it happens, less so in the United States. We have a little bit more CSP proportionally, and I'll speak about that later. But globally, PV is dominant and will continue to be so for a long time. And it's a beautiful technology for one particular reason. Its technical efficiency is scale invariant. So one single PV cell can be just as efficient as 100,000 cells in a large-scale utility facility. That's unusual for power technologies. And what it does is it means that PV can be deployed at a much broader range of scales. So that's why we can have practical rooftop photovoltaics. It's really a key pathway for distributed energy generation, given what we have available today. Now, with that said, it is sensitive in terms of the economies of scale, and there is a contrast between the economies of a residential rooftop system and a utility scale system. And there are real consequences to those scales, which we'll speak about. A key drawback, though, for PV is, unfortunately, when the sun goes away, your generation goes away. So it is a truly intermittent resource. And that means that going forward, at larger scales in particular, any system that's going to be dependent on PV as a primary pathway for generation is going to require some other form of storage in reality in order to make it work. And storage, I mean in the broadest possible sense. So that could be anything from pumped hydro, of course, right the way through to advanced batteries, and indeed fast-reacting gas, which won't do much most of the time, but when called upon can react quickly. CSP, by contrast, is a less mature technology. a much smaller scale deployment. Most of the deployment has been here in the US and in Spain. And it's really all about large scale systems. So it's different. It's more traditional in the sense that the economies and the technical efficiencies scale. You need to go big or go home if you're focused on CSP facilities. It also has the drawback in that because it's about focusing solar energy, you need very clear skies for it to make sense. So that limits the geographical footprint where CSP technologies make sense. Here in the States, again, the Southwest is a good area for it, but CSP, as I'll show you, in places like the Northeast, where we have a lot of PV penetration, just makes no sense, simply because we don't have enough direct normal incident radiation. The one beauty, though, with respect to CSP is that because it's a thermal-based system, you're effectively heating up a working fluid. You can effectively develop a dispatchable renewable source. So integration of storage with CSP systems is very, very straightforward. And if we were able to move its economics closer to the PV frontier, it would be quite a compelling option because of the fact that it comes with storage built in, or very easily built in at least. So a little bit on how the market is evolving in terms of installations and so on. So this is just a global picture of cumulative PV installations. So this year we're going to add about 65 gigawatts globally, which is a lot. And certainly more than half of that is actually just going to be in 3 markets. So here in the States, in Japan, and in China. And this is in contrast to where growth has come from over the past number of years, where it was centered in Europe, Germany in particular, but also Spain and Italy. Those countries took a particular approach to supporting the growth of solar installation through feed-in tariffs and other support mechanisms. They're now running into trouble with them, and to various degrees in different countries. And I think it has led to some pause, certainly in Europe, with respect to whether or not PV is a pathway that makes sense for them. We're learning from that, though, and so are the Chinese and the Japanese. And I think certainly for the medium term, at least, the US, China, and Japan are going to be the catalyst for growth. Here in the States, just to kind of tear it apart a little bit more, this is the picture of what we've been doing. We've actually been growing our installations at a more rapid rate than the global level. So since 2008, installation levels in the US have increased by about 18x. So really, really rapid growth. Now this is from an incredibly small base, but this is still very exciting. That's why people are getting excited about PV. This year, I should add, we will install as a nation more PV generation capacity than any other form of generation capacity. And certainly for the solar sector, that's quite a milestone. That's quite a milestone. And I think it's indicative of the fact that solar now is coming to the big boys' table, certainly. In terms of how we're deploying it, this graphic here just breaks that down. You can deploy it from your rooftop right the way up until very large-scale ground-mounted units. The vast majority of our capacity is really built in that large-scale facility, is captured in those large-scale utility-scale facilities. But I think a lot of the public awareness, a lot of the excitement is coming from the rooftop concept. People see solar on roofs and like, oh, this is great. Somehow this is the paradigm that we're going to deploy at. I'm going to make an argument that although rooftop solar is going to be important, it's likely not going to be the vector for that large-scale build-up that you would have to have if solar is going to play a bigger role. Where's the solar? Well, the solar is, half of it is in California. 2 reasons for that. The first reason is that they have lots of sun, so that helps a lot. But the second reason is that they have had a very, very supportive policy environment in California, which has helped draw a lot of capacity onto their systems. Today, though, we're seeing a broader suite of states getting into the Solar Act. So Arizona is an important state, has been at least. Recently, some changes to policies in Arizona are going to cause some challenges there. But Arizona has an excellent solar resource, so it makes a lot of sense. There are other states here, though, that are important solar centers of growth today, like Massachusetts, though, where things are a little bit less clear as to why we're growing that type of capacity. In Massachusetts, it's certainly a focus on, there's a policy focus that we want to grow solar capacity in-state. I'm going to also argue later on today that that isn't necessarily the most sensible thing. I think it's great that myself and my wife as Massachusetts ratepayers are getting a lot of our power from solar, be it real or virtual, but the fact that it has to be sited in Massachusetts isn't necessarily all that sensible from an economic perspective. So we'll discuss that. But this is the situation that we're seeing. So a lot of dynamics in many, many parts of the country. And of course, Texas is becoming an increasingly important center for solar growth. Go ahead.
Is the megawatts, is it based on actual metered production, or is it based on what was
Capacity.
counted by speed? We sold this person, whatever, 50 kW.
Purely capacity. Purely capacity. So not megawatt hours of energy, but megawatts of capacity. Nameplate capacity. So an excellent question. Important to realize that. That's why putting in lots of capacity, so if we had just as much capacity installed in Massachusetts as Arizona, we're still only getting about half as much energy from our systems because of the difference in the resource. So what has been driving this growth? What's supporting this rapid expansion here in the States? Well, a number of factors, which are interrelated, of course. Probably the most important factor is that the fundamental costs have fallen very dramatically over the past 5 or 6 years. So this graphic here is illustrating three things. It's illustrating how the price of residential systems and utility scale systems have changed since 2008, and it's also illustrating how the cost of the PV module, the core element in those systems, has evolved during that period of time. And basically what you'll see is that since 2008, the module price has fallen by 85%. Right? That is incredible, of course. And that's been very, very important. In fact, it really represents the vast majority of the cost reduction in total system costs, both at the utility scale and at the residential scale. Now, why this has come about is quite complex. Some technologists will argue, well, look at the great performance that we've been able to draw out from our systems. That's true. There's been technical improvement in the technologies over the past decade, but in reality, most of this cost reduction has come about by important and strong market forces. China has played a very big role. They've built very large-scale facilities, and then they've had a very, very serious amount of competition, which has pushed prices down very, very considerably. Certainly below what would be considered acceptable levels. So the Chinese for a while have been operating at negative margins. You will see since 2012 though that this kind of secular decline in prices has arrested, and that's because the Chinese now are reverting, they're beginning to get a grasp of a handle on things, and they're beginning to take some margin now from their facilities. In reality, the module costs are beginning to approach what we consider like technical floors. So we're going to continue to see incremental cost reduction from today's technologies, but the kind of profound gains that we've seen over the past few years are not going to be replicated. And that means that we're going to have to change focus a little bit and now begin to focus on what we call the balance of system, the remaining bits and pieces that go into putting a system on the roof or deploying it out in the field. And dealing with balance of system is going to be more complicated. Much more fragmented, it's much more sensitive to things like steel and concrete prices, labor, local labor prices, local labor regulation, and the cost of finance and legal services. And these are not easily managed. Nevertheless, there are some opportunities to go after them. The other thing that has been important for supporting this growth has been the subsidy paradigm that has existed, and there have been a number of important ones. The primary one is the federal investment tax credit, which provides a 30% tax credit to these types of facilities. That is about to expire. The end of next year will expire for residential systems. It's going to revert from 30% to 10% for anything larger than a residential system. And that will have an impact on the economics of these technologies if it goes ahead. I think it remains unclear as to whether or not the ITC will just revert, or whether there may be some horse trading in Washington and there's a quid pro quo to maintain this subsidy paradigm in place. This is not a very good mechanism, by the way, for subsidizing solar. Investment tax credits work fine if the product had a uniform price, but because residential systems have a very different cost profile to utility scale systems, what we end up with and what we have today is a situation where different types of systems receive very different levels of subsidy for the same product, and that's a problem. But nevertheless, we believe that the tax credit, the investment tax credit, is most likely one to remain in place. There's also going to be some challenge, important challenges, with respect to net metering, which is another issue that I'm going to speak about, which has been important in helping grow the residential sector in particular, and which is now coming under greater scrutiny in many, many states. Nevertheless, it's worth reflecting on where we are today at least, and then we can consider what's going to happen going forward with respect to solar's competitiveness. So this graphic here is purely to give you a sense of where solar looks or sits today in terms of its economic competitiveness versus an important benchmark in the power sector, which is an investment in a new combined cycle gas plant, for example. Now, what we have here on the vertical axis are the levelized cost of electricity for a CCGT system, a gas peaker system, and then a range of PV and CSP systems in different locations, given today's economics. And the real takeaway here, the important takeaway here, is that in regions like California, at the utility scale, where you have very good resource and really, really very attractively low capital costs today for solar, it is beginning to enter into the zone of interest in terms of its competitiveness with new investment in gas, for example. In fact, these numbers represent utility scale facilities at about $1.80 per watt. That's what a system could be delivered at today, more or less. But really, most projects that are being planned today and that are being bid into, utility PPA auctions and so on, RFPs, are priced on the forward curve. So developers who are building these utility facilities are saying, I expect I can get the price down by, let's say, 20 or 30 cents by the time I'm having to bring the system online. And we're seeing very, very aggressively low PPA prices now being signed for utility scale solar in places like California today. $40 per megawatt hour, for example, which is really very aggressive. And that's getting to the point where solar is looking competitive even without subsidy in some markets. Now, in other markets, the story is very different, and this is a very important point to take away. Many people today kind of have this uniform message that, well, solar's here. Solar is here in some places, and that's great. Solar is certainly not here in terms of competitiveness in many other markets. So utility scale in Massachusetts, for example, even with the same economics, same capex, is way out of the money, and will continue to be so for a long time because our solar resource is much poorer. And then solar at the rooftop scale is way out of the money if you're concerned about the energy-only aspect. Now, some of you guys will ask, well, look, I'm hearing that solar is a great investment for an individual homeowner, and in many places it actually is, and that's because of the support mechanisms, things like net metering, that are in place. The reasons that those mechanisms have been put in place are many, and they're all well-intentioned and so on, but ultimately, if solar is to play a big, big role going forward, solar and its deployment is going to have to compete on an energy basis in most markets. So rooftop today remains challenged from that perspective. Just on the far side there, that's just a snapshot of CSP. So you'll see CSP in California remains relatively expensive, and that's because of its relative immaturity compared to the PV space. I added in Massachusetts just to illustrate that you don't build CSP where it's cloudy, and that's about as much humor as you're going to get from me today. Now, this is a snapshot of today, right? So today the point is that on the margin in certain markets, solar is getting interesting in terms of its competitiveness. But that's only on the margin. And in future, if solar is going to become an important part of our power supply, things are going to change. There are going to be some fundamental impacts that solar will have on the broader power markets that are going to have profound impacts on the power markets broadly, on us as consumers, and on solar itself and its competitiveness. And I'm illustrating that here. So, and bear with me on this graphic. What we have here basically is an illustration of how average wholesale electricity prices in Texas, here in ERCOT specifically, would evolve as we introduce and then grow solar as a percentage of the peak demand on the system on average over the course of a year. So I'm colorblind now, so first I should apologize for all my color schemes, but it made sense to me. But I think the red line is the one that I want to draw out here. That illustrates how the average wholesale market price will evolve as we push more and more solar into the system. And what you'll see, basically, is that as we introduce more and more solar, the wholesale market price falls. So why does it fall? It's quite simple. It falls because solar has zero marginal cost, so it always runs, and it displaces out the other end of the dispatch stack a higher cost resource, the highest cost resource as it happens. And so as we move more and more solar onto the system, the average wholesale price will fall because we're dispatching more expensive resources less of the time. That's very good. Until a certain point, you'll see it kind of inflects up again, and that's because we have now added so much solar that we're now having to change some dispatch order. We might have to start cycling base load, which gets quite expensive, and you have some dynamics. But this is a scenario without storage, and maybe in the future, if we have very low-cost storage, some of these issues can be mitigated. Nevertheless, solar, lots of it, will actually push down somewhat wholesale market prices. Now, the story is a little bit different if you own the solar plant, though, and that's important. So the blue line illustrates what happens if you own the solar plant and the price that you receive at different levels of penetration. So you'll notice that at lower levels of penetration, say up to 6%, the solar asset owner is receiving an average price that's a good deal higher than the average wholesale market price. So why is that? The reason that's happening is that solar only generates power when the sun's shining, and most of that in the middle of the day. The price of power tends to be higher, certainly in ERCOT, during those hours. So adding some solar to the system during those hours means that the solar asset owner is going to receive those higher prices over that shorter duration, and they earn a return that's a little bit better than the average. But if we start adding more and more solar, a lot more solar, 20, 30%, you see that the price that the solar asset owner receives collapses. And the reason for that is during those hours in the middle of the day, all of that solar is running flat out, and it's displacing out at the other end of the stack all of those higher cost assets that are setting the price in the market. That's going to reduce the price significantly in the market. And that's going to be a big challenge for solar. For solar to remain competitive as an investment option at 18 or 24% penetration, the capital cost will have to be much lower if the investors are going to meet their hurdle rate. So this is an important issue that solar is going to have to contend with going forward. And this is already happening in some places. So this is Germany. This is an illustration of wholesale market prices in Germany from 2006 to 2012. During that period of time, the Germans saw huge growth in their installed photovoltaic capacity. And what we're illustrating here is just how the wholesale market price relative to a benchmark average changes during the course of the day. So in 2006, when there wasn't very much solar at all on their system, you'll see that it had quite a peaky trajectory. So prices during the midday hour were very, very high relative to the average price. That's great news, by the way, if you own a coal plant, because you're taking all of that rent. You're running your baseline plant, but you're making a lot of money during those hours. But as we moved more and more solar onto the system, that solar began to generate a lot of power in the middle of the day, meant we needed less of those more expensive resources. And you'll see that the average wholesale price during those hours fell. Now in Germany, they have a feed-in tariff, so solar asset owners didn't care, wasn't impacting them. They were receiving whatever their feed-in tariff was. But for other participants in this market, the owners of generation, this has been a nightmare. So any of you care to look into it, many of the major generators in Germany, their businesses have been decimated because of some of this, mainly because of this dynamic and the impact that PV penetration has had on wholesale market prices in the German market. So there's nothing wrong with this, really, but we have to think carefully about how we design markets going forward so that these dynamics can be understood and so that we can ensure that we have market structures in place that can ensure reliability of the system even with these kind of dynamics taking place. And that leads me to some messages from our recent solar study. Some of the key messages. Really, we've tried to synthesize it down to 3 points. The first point is that we now need to begin to take a very long-term approach to technology development. In the future, solar is going to effectively be killing its own competitiveness. More solar on the system means more price suppression during those hours where solar is generating, which means that solar itself will need to be lower cost in order to be competitive. We need to think about the technologies that will allow us to ensure solar can be competitive in that paradigm. We have crystalline silicon and a few other bits and pieces today, and they have some runway to go in terms of cost reduction, but at very large scales, they are going to find it difficult to get to the cost levels needed. The other issue is that we need to really prepare for much larger penetration of PV on the systems level. So running power systems reliably with lots more solar is going to be more complicated. It's going to be more complicated technically, it's going to be more complicated on the market side. And we need to think about that now so that we have in place frameworks that make sense. And the third point is that we should be a little bit more thoughtful about the subsidy mechanisms we're actually using. And right now in particular, we should look to try and enhance the efficiency of these subsidy mechanisms. And that comes back to the ITC and some of the challenges there. So let me briefly run through some of the points regarding this. I'm not going to spend too much time on technology, but I just want to make a couple of key points. So first, this is today crystalline silicon, either multi or single crystalline silicon is really the mainstay of the solar sector. It's beautiful technology. It's efficient, it's well established, it's very reliable, it's robust, and it's durable. Non-toxic, by the way, that's also helpful. But, at least in terms of solar technologies, it's thick. The wafers, we're chopping them down to 100 microns. It's still a really thick wafer as it happens. It's rigid, and the rigidity requires a certain type of module form factor, which is relatively heavy, requires a lot of encapsulation. And crucially, crystalline technologies, simple molecules but very pure structures, require very expensive manufacturing. So lots of high vacuum, lots of high temperature, and that's expensive. So it's difficult to move the needle. China has brought us plants that are at scale. We really can't build a bigger plant and really crank out more economies of scale. So we're beginning, as I said, to explore the floor of what this technology can do for us. So where do we go? Well, there are a range of emerging technologies that will not fill this void today, and we shouldn't worry about that, but have the potential in 10 years, in 15 years, to really become the gold standard for photovoltaics technology. And they have a number of characteristics that are different from today's technologies. So they're almost all deployable in a very light and flexible form factor. So we're talking about thin films, things like perovskites, dye-sensitized cells, and so on. They are capable of being manufactured in very high throughput paradigms, so roll-to-roll printing effectively, without temperature or vacuum issues, which is great. And they're, and this is important, they'll need to be manufacturable from abundant materials. Silicon is abundant, certainly, but some of the other thin films that we're basing today, that are being used today, cadmium telluride, for example, are not very abundant. And to scale them will be very, very challenging. Going to this type of technology does two things for us. By having a thin film, flexible substrate, and a roll-to-roll or very low-cost manufacturing paradigm, we can have much cheaper cells. That's important. But also, that new form factor will certainly provide us with greater flexibility, pardon the pun, when it comes to the balance of system. And reducing the balance of system is almost as important, is as important now, in fact, as dealing with the cells themselves. Challenges today, though, we have low efficiencies for some of these technologies, although perovskites have suddenly shown real promise. They have all relatively poor stability, so they're in the lab. You can write a paper about them, but we cannot prove them for 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, and we're going to have to get to that if they're going to work. And as I said, they're unproven at scale. But this is a research agenda, and this is where we need to be focusing our efforts now, because these paradigms have real opportunity, real potential. Second message, so the preparation for very large-scale penetration. So what's that all about? Well, the first thing that's all about is we need to understand what deploying lots of PV onto the system will do to the broader power system, and how we have to mitigate that, or how we have to handle that. So this graphic here is again illustrating an ERCOT scenario. And what happens here, or what would happen here in Texas if we added certain amounts of solar as a proportion of peak demand to the system. So in this first instance here, we have solar PV meeting 12% of peak demand. And what you'll notice here is that it actually shaves some of the capacity requirement. Right? So in this instance, PV actually can yield some capacity value, which is very exciting actually. But as we grow penetration levels to much higher levels, you'll notice that the capacity required from non-PV resource doesn't change. Right? So there's no more value. So we're going to have lots more solar, but we're still going to require other assets available, though not doing anything, in order to reliably operate the system. And that's going to have a cost, and we have to think about how we can manage that. The second issue is that as you push penetration levels, you see that the ramp rate that's required for the non-solar asset becomes steeper and steeper. It's very difficult to ramp at some of these rates. This is, by the way, a version of the California duck chart, for those of you familiar with it. Becomes very difficult to ramp a lot of the certainly baseload assets at the rates that are required in these types of scenarios. So what we really need is we'll need to have some type of technology available, likely a more advanced storage technology, if you don't have hydro available, in order to provide this backup. And it's going to cost money. It could, by the way, be gas peakers, but you're going to have it available, and you're going to have to pay for it, even though it's not spinning most of the time. So in Texas here, for example, the market structure will have to add a capacity element to it rather than being a purely energy-based market. These are not complex. These are not simple issues to overcome, and now we need to start thinking about them very carefully. Just to illustrate why storage is important, so this graphic here, and I apologize for the poor quality, just illustrates how storage adds some value back if you have it available. So this surface here, this XY surface here, that edge represents the decline in the return that the solar asset owner would see as solar penetration levels grow, and we showed that earlier. So more and more solar on the system, the return that the solar asset owner sees falls very quickly. But if we begin then to add some storage, and this is naive to the cost of that storage. But if we have that storage available and we can add it, what you'll see is that as more storage is available, that storage actually helps the solar asset to drag more value out of the system, because you're not now dumping all of your power into the market right in the middle of the day. You're spreading it out over the course of the 24-hour period, and you're trying to do better with respect to that energy and the value in the market. So solar storage helps solar, and the two can really not be separated, and that's an important point going forward. California has had this experience where they've pushed solar very, very strongly, and now they're running into some real issues that are requiring storage, and now they're pushing a lot of storage, and that's quite expensive, and we really need to take a more systemic look at how we bring these systems together. The other issue that we need to contend with when we're integrating solar and integrating solar onto the system is net metering. So today, net metering is a very important mechanism for supporting residential scale solar in particular. And It's really quite simple, so we'll just kind of illustrate what it's all about. So here we have a traditional paradigm, utility consumers A to N, and this is how you're paying for your energy. You're paying some of your per kilowatt hour rate, your tariff, for energy, and some for the use of the wires effectively. And this is, I mean, there are some variations of this, but this is the basic paradigm. Net metering was a mechanism that was used and that has been used and is used to support penetration or support the growth of residential solar in particular in some markets, Massachusetts being an example. And really how that works is that if I was consumer A and I put a system on my roof, solar system on my roof, every kilowatt hour that I would generate that flowed into the system would be compensated at the full rate. Okay, the full utility tariff rate. So effectively, I'm receiving payment for the energy that I'm generating, and on top of that, I'm receiving effectively a subsidy, and the subsidy is the amount that I would pay for the use of the wires. This was fine 5 years ago. Utilities liked it, in fact, because it was simple administratively to implement and so on. But now, in some areas where you have a lot of rooftop solar, this is eroding the revenue base quite considerably for the utilities. And many of them are taking a kind of a blunt approach to trying to deal with this and saying, look, we want to revise our tariff structures entirely. For example, you now have to pay a fixed price, a fixed fee for your wires rather than base it on volumetric usage and so on. It changes the calculus entirely for the rooftop market. So for any of you who want to look into this more, Arizona is really where this is happening right now. There have been a number of contentious issues, rate cases in Arizona. Both Arizona Public Service and the Salt River Project have managed to have fixed elements added to their tariffs, which are really impacting the residential rooftop business in Arizona. In Massachusetts, we have this situation, but in Massachusetts, our regulators think this is fine because we, as a state, have chosen that this is a path that we want to go. It's a very expensive path, but it's a path that they want to go with. We're going to see this kind of juxtaposition in different states, different approaches to this, but it's an increasingly complex and contentious issue that the solar industry is going to have to contend with for the next few years. And then I'm going to spend 5 minutes, Varun, on subsidies, and then we can wrap up for some discussion. So subsidies, why are subsidies important? Well, today subsidies are very important. Solar's growth has really been enabled by the subsidies that are in place. And we argue in our study, any of you that choose to have a look at it, that subsidies are very important and should be maintained, actually. But what we also argue is that we should take a more thoughtful approach to the structure of those subsidies so that they're as efficient as possible. And today's subsidy paradigm is not very efficient. So let me explain why not. So if we look at the solar industry in the States today and we look at the bookends, you have utility scale on one side and you have residential scale on the other side. And pricing mechanisms differ quite considerably in these two worlds. So in the utility scale, this is a world where monopsony power exists, really. So how it works is that large utilities, for example, Pacific Gas and Electric, need to bring solar onto their system. So they issue an RFP and say, we want to acquire 300 megawatts of solar PV in the next couple of years. Give us your best offers. And they push a lot of competition. A lot of developers are keen for that sort of business. And there's a lot of competition and has driven prices for those PPA contracts really right down. And this is illustrated here. Here's the data to illustrate that point. These are PPA prices and how they've evolved in different parts of the country. And we're now approaching a point where we're seeing regularly PPAs being signed at less than $50 per megawatt hour, which is really very competitive. There is very little margin between what it costs to build a facility and what these prices look like. So very little rent taking, and that's indicative of a nice competitive market. Things are a little bit different in the residential sector. So this is a slightly complex graphic that might require some time, but let me try and work through it. So we have a competitive market scenario and an immature, less competitive market scenario. In a competitive market, if a system costs in the unsubsidized sense, maybe $3.25 cents per watt, which is what a residential system costs today, ballpark, then a consumer would ultimately be willing to pay a net price of about $2.27 for that system, bearing in mind that they will receive a subsidy of nearly $1. So that's what the competitive price structure will look like. So this is what it costs you to put it on the roof. This is what you can ultimately sell in terms of net price to the consumer. But in markets aren't quite as competitive, where there might be some information asymmetry, for example, where there's another benchmark available, like a utility rate. Then you often end up with a situation where consumers have a net willingness to pay rather than going straight after the lowest possible or the competitive price. So in this instance here, we just have an example of a willingness to pay net of the subsidy of about $3.15 per watt, which, by the way, happens to be ballpark what most consumers in California would be willing to pay if they looked at their utility rate, looked at maybe a 10 or 15% discount from it, and then worked that back into the cost of a solar system. Those developers that are aware of this, and they all are, of course, they understand this, and that means that they can sell the systems gross of the subsidy for up to $4.50 per watt. Now, why does that matter? That matters because the subsidy is calculated on the top line number, right? So if you can up the gross price, you amplify the subsidy, and that means that you're getting more subsidy for the same system that's doing exactly the same thing, simply because of the immaturity of that market, and that's not necessarily an ideal situation. This really bears out, this dynamic, the willingness to pay concept bears out in the data. So here's some data for how prices for residential systems have evolved in different markets since 2010. What you'll find down here is that in some markets, Arizona, for example, where the utility rates are lower, the price that systems are being sold at is a good deal lower. In Massachusetts, by contrast, where we pay a lot for our electricity, developers are able to sell systems at much higher prices. And this is an important dynamic. It's a dynamic that speaks to how efficient our subsidies are. And, I think it's going to play itself out over time. Consumers are going to develop better insight into the cost of their systems. There's going to be more information available and so on. But right now, the residential market, at least, is just not as competitive as we'd like it to be. I'm going to give these slides so we can go through it. But the final point that I wanted to bring out was how this issue with respect to the efficiency of the ITC subsidy structure in particular has been used by some really smart guys in the residential rooftop PV leasing business to really help their business. Okay? So for those of you not familiar with it, you can lease a system rather than buy a system. And leasing a rooftop system makes a lot of sense. It really democratizes solar because you don't have to come up with the 20 or 30 grand to buy the system. And you don't need to have a very large tax appetite in order to monetize the subsidy. What you effectively do is you sign a PPA for a system that sits on your roof, and over 20 years you lease the system, just like a car lease in reality. Now, the thing about this is that when it comes to claiming the subsidy, there's a challenge because the system hasn't been sold. The system has been leased to you. So the owner of the system, the leaser, they actually are faced with the need to establish a cost basis, the number that they calculate the subsidy on. And there are a number of ways of doing it in the tax code. They can say, well, here's the invoices for the bits and pieces that we put on the roof. This will be akin to you buying the system and sending that to the IRS. And they say, well, that's what the cost basis was. Give me 30% of that. That's one way, and that's fine. But there's another option. And the other option is that they can claim and they can establish the cost basis for the system based on the income that that asset is going to generate. So you have signed a lease. That lease effectively represents the net present value of that lease, represents the value of that asset from an income perspective. If the leaser has been able to sell you a lease at a price that is decoupled from the cost of the system, because, say, for example, you have an expensive utility rate and you think that 10% discount from that was good value, even though the system itself costs much less, you are going to end up with a situation where the leaser can amplify significantly the cost basis for their subsidy, and they can derive a much larger per watt subsidy than you would get if you were simply calculating it based on the cost. It's just illustrated here. So here's what a system is worth to a leaser if they use these two methods for calculating the cost basis for the subsidy. If they use what we call the cost method, so the invoiced cost, they have a present value for the lease. That's going to be about $3 in many markets. And then they have the subsidy value for the system. And the subsidy value for the system amplifies back up to a point where the total system is worth about $4.25. If they take the income method, though, something changes. So the income method, the income that's generated by that asset is, of course, the value of the lease, but it's also the value of the subsidy itself. So the leasers, when they go to the IRS, they say, this is the value of that system to me. It's the value of the lease plus the value of the subsidy you're about to give me. Leases that are above market rates, that are non-competitive, allow you to amplify the subsidy that you're able to claim quite considerably, and it's just illustrated here. So in the income-based method example, in this instance, for a system that just costs $3.25 per watt to build, you're actually able to claim $1.45 per watt in subsidy because of this income-based method dynamic. It's a really, really important part of that business model. It provides cash up front, and the leasers have used this to grow their businesses very, very quickly. But it's really inefficient from a taxpayer subsidy perspective, because here, if we just based the subsidy on 30% of the cost, you'll see it's 50% lower. And on top of that, if you want to step all the way back and you look at this, you say, why are we subsidizing rooftop systems significantly more than utility scale systems, which might cost $1.60 per watt to install, and only cost us about 50 or 60 cents per watt in subsidy for the same product? So this is the tension that exists today with these kind of subsidy mechanisms that we're going to have to deal with in the shorter term. So with that, I'm going to wrap up and leave us some time for a few questions and some discussion. But I'd like to thank you all for your attention. It's great.
Questions?
Yeah, sure.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. So my question is, so the appraised value that you talked about in the last few slides,
Yes.
is that the same in all states where solar is active in US, or only California, or
So the appraised value, or this income-based method, that can vary from house to house effectively. So it depends on what you can sell the lease for.
okay, so based on the utility, like value, price of electricity in that
All
area.
right, so yes, importantly, I mean, this whole capacity to sell these leases and the pricing of leases is linked really closely to what the utility rate is. So here in Austin, for example, Austin Energy is going to charge you $1 or a cent per kilowatt hour rate. That rate is the anchor for most residential consumers in this instance. And typically what you'll find is that leases are offered at maybe 15 or 20% below that rate. And that becomes quite compelling from a consumer perspective. That feels like good value. It is, in fact, good value. The point here, though, is that by buying it, you would get even better value. It's just that the consumers either don't know that or don't have access to the capital and so on. Now, this is very powerful in states like California, where utility rates are very high, and in particular, where utility rates are even tiered. So in California, for example, there's an escalating tier. What you have to appreciate is that, and similarly in Massachusetts. So leasing has been hot stuff in Massachusetts and been a good business. But in markets like Texas, for example, where utility rates are a good deal lower, then this ability to push these higher valuations falls. And in fact, actually, I mean, I didn't go through it, but analytically, if you have competitive markets, you get exactly the same result from these two valuation mechanisms. So the only reason that this is leading to this divergence today is that the markets are not competitive. I should, just as an anecdote, the reason that we have this paradigm is that the ITC for solar is really a derivative of real estate investment tax credits. And of course, in real estate, the value of a property is really the value of the rental for that property. So that's the same idea here, except that these guys are able to rent at much above market rates, if you wish, or above competitive market rates, at least. Yep, shoot. So personally, I think the tax credit, there will be some, as I said, horse trading, and this will, the tax credit and maybe pipelines from Canada might get conflated, and there might be a quid pro quo. Who knows? But I don't think that we're going to see much change, actually. I think there's already a lot of agitation to maintain the ITC. The ITC is a poor approach, right? Tax credits in general are a poor approach because along with this issue with respect to different cost bases for the same product, a lot of developers can't even monetize the tax credit. Okay, so if you build a large-scale utility facility, costs you a couple $100 million, and you're a smaller developer, you're getting a tax credit for $50 or $100 million. You don't have $50 or $100 million of tax liability. So to monetize that, you need to go to the tax equity market. There are 20 or 30 companies with large tax appetites who are looking to use these tax credits to offset their tax bill. But these companies, Google, Apple, many of the big investment banks, for example, but these companies, they're not going to give you 30 cents of tax, of dollar, 30 cents of money for 30 cents of tax credit because they may as well just pay the tax, right? So they'll give you 20 cents for 30 cents of tax credit. So it's a huge leakage from this system. What we would advocate, I mean, the ideal situation will be to have a direct payment for production, right? That would be quite efficient, but difficult, and we don't think the infrastructure is in place to do it well. So what probably makes sense is a production tax credit, something like they have in the wind industry, because at least there you're receiving the tax credit in a more bite-sized chunk, and you may not have to go to the tax equity market to the same extent. We shall see. But I'm pretty confident that this is going to mean that the tax credit in some form is going to remain in place after 2016.
Can you speak to why you don't think an energy-only market can satisfy high solar penetrations?
Yeah, no, I mean, in theory, the notion would be that in a perfect energy-only market, there will be actors who are willing to make an investment for the few hours that will allow them to capture the super rents to pay for that investment. But where you have price caps in energy markets, like you guys have here, yeah, but $9,000 is not enough to pay for your plant over the course of a few hours each year. So I mean, but I should step back from that. It's not clear at all that today's broad concept with respect to energy markets based on the marginal cost is fit for purpose for a very heavy renewables future. We may need something entirely different. That work is only beginning. But certainly there's going to have to be some incentive put in place to bring capital to the market, to put capacity in place. And frankly, probably a lot more, considering some of the capacity is going to be relatively immature technology in some instances. So I think that's going to be a challenge. Yes?
Yeah, thank you again. Excellent data. Yeah, in ERCOT, actually, there's an effort for reforming or
Correct.
enhancing the ancillary services.
Yes.
For fast ramping, so provide value to that versus a capacity market in a classic PJM sense. A couple things. Chart 8, you had some comparisons there. Did you have any quantification for the value of the hedging value? Because it's very difficult, and I honestly have never gotten but maybe a modified Black-Scholes model for the value of hedge. So once you get a 20-year PPA and it's fixed,
Yes.
there has to be an economic value to that fixed cost versus the variable costs for that. And so do you have any assessment of that?
You know, we haven't tried to parse that apart, and specifically we haven't looked at those hedge values. But certainly what you'll find is that if you were actually to step back and take a project and look at the bits and pieces involved, there has to be some other value streams that these guys are tapping into in order to make these PPAs work, given their CapEx profile and their hurdle rates and so on. And I think that's one of those elements that they're using to amplify the value for themselves.
I was thinking about it from the standpoint of the buyer versus the developer.
how PG&E and the Californian utilities and so on, it's not clear to us how they have been, they're quite happy to go with this. It's remarkable. They're loving it, actually. So it's clear that there's something in it for them other than just purely compliance with the state level regulation.
Mm-hmm. And do you have cost breakdowns for where the break-even points would be for storage on a, say, dollars per kilowatt hour basis? That
we do actually in the study, we've looked into that. And, you're really looking at, once you have higher level penetration of solar, this natural flattening of the peak means that the window, the arbitrage spread narrows very considerably. So storage is going to have to be really cheap in order for it to be interesting and to make sense. And so, $100 per kilowatt hour or lower, right, is where you're going to have to be going in order for this to be interesting in a world where you're not heavily subsidizing it. Yeah.
So thank you for the talk. And you mentioned several times that that the market is not competitive, and
At the residential level.
at residential
Right.
level. So that means that there are too few installers or developers, or what is
So,
driving over there?
it's quite interesting. So it's quite fragmented. It's a business where there's a huge, today in the US in particular, it's a feature of our market, there's a huge marketing cost associated. So customer acquisition is really expensive, 50 cents per watt in some instances. And you need scale to actually be able to handle that. The other thing that's really important is that the guys that are in the leasing business, for them to actually be able to go and access the tax equity market, they need to be aggregating thousands of systems, individual systems, into a portfolio of rooftop systems to take to the tax equity market. Because you cannot do a tax equity deal for minimum $50 million, but really you need $100 million. It's going to cost you several $1 million just to do the deal. So what you tend to find is that, but then you've access to the tax equity market. So these guys, the bigger players in that space now, they are actually able to exercise a lot of pricing power. So if they're under pressure by some upstart, they can push prices down because they can use their ability to leverage the subsidy that others cannot to squeeze them out. So we think this is an important barrier actually to entry in this space.
Also, so it's kind of naturally the market is converts to be a kind of a few competitors because you have to be so big.
Yeah, you know what, we actually think that it's going to be the other way around. So this leasing business is going to become, if the ITC goes away, this leasing business goes away. It's not possible to do it, right? Because it's so capital intensive, you can't own all of these systems. So really where we see the transition is away from leasing and towards finance, loans effectively, selling loans. And that is a more interesting space. And what we actually believe is that financial players, and it's already happening, are going to begin to develop solar-focused products, a bit like car loans, which smaller installers are going to be able to use, add to their portfolio, and they're going to be able to then finance a product for individual homeowners. You're beginning to see some of that already. The leasing has been great because it has proved the concept, really. But it's not really a long-term sustainable thing. The solar loan, I think, is going to have a longer runway. And that will actually allow smaller players to be a little bit more competitive. But I think it's still going to take some time to play out. Yeah.
Thanks.
So with that, thank you very much.